The subcommittee will come to order, and I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank our witnesses today. Many have traveled great distance, and we are here to discuss the topic of climate change, a global issue that challenges our ability to sustain life on Earth. Our job in Congress is to frame the magnitude of this challenge and provide a practical pathway forward that is regionally sensitive. 97% of scientists agree that the Earth is warming at an unsustainable rate and that humans and human activity are the primary cause. Burning fossil fuels like coal and oil for energy are the main contributors to greenhouse gases. NOAA has issued several predictions that this year of 2019 is increasingly likely to be the planet's second or third warmest calendar year on record. And our witnesses and all of us see the impacts of this every day, from the growing intensity of extreme weather events, like recent wildfires in California, to increasingly powerful hurricanes across the Gulf and East Coast. Glaciers and sea ice are melting at historic rates, with the Arctic warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Our oceans are warming and acidifying. Just ask our colleague, Shelley Pingree of Maine. It is dangerous to ignore these facts, and if we fail to work together to address this crisis, it is to our collective peril. In my district, impacts can be seen in record rainfall and the rising water levels of the Great Lakes, now at a 124-year high, including Lake Erie, the southernmost of the Great Lakes, which broke records in September and is currently over 2 feet higher than long-term averages. In 2014, a massive harmful algal bloom resulting from nutrient runoff from the largest watershed in the Great Lakes forced the city of Toledo to shut off its water supply. For days, hundreds of thousands of people could not drink, bathe, or cook with tap water. In this particular watershed, which is, as I mentioned, the largest in the Great Lakes, the number of farm animals has more than doubled from 9 million to 20 million over the past 13 years, with a corresponding increase in manure. All of these conflate and have helped create the algal bloom problem that we face in that lake. Globally, we must commit to addressing these new challenges by engaging the world through the Paris Climate Agreement. Unfortunately, the President ceded American leadership on this vital concern by withdrawing from this agreement without any backup plan in place. As the second largest global emitter of harmful gases, producing nearly 1/5 of all global emissions, our country's withdrawal will have significant consequences on the environment, public health, and the economy. However, we are lucky to have a Department of Energy, the federal government's leading agency for research and development of new clean energy technologies within this subcommittee's jurisdiction. Technologies developed with Department of Energy funding are already helping address climate change. Decades of investment have driven down the prices of wind, solar, energy storage, and efficient light bulbs by 59 to 94% over the last decade, leading to widespread deployment and consumer savings. But of course, there's more work to be done. Continued robust investments in Department of Energy programs will create new tools to prevent and reverse the impacts of climate change while boosting our economy and creating good-paying jobs across every state. Currently, there are more Americans in energy efficiency jobs than waitresses and waiters across our country. We must continue to transition not just sectors, but people and communities. Additionally, as clean energy becomes cheaper, consumers can save their hard-earned dollars by paying less for the energy they use. Our nation must undertake mitigation now, but we must also pursue future energy innovation. The Department of Energy's research agenda achieves the next series of breakthroughs in clean energy, which is vital to saving our planet. As the rest of the world continues to act and to innovate, our country must be a technology leader, or we will not only be left behind, but we will have abdicated our responsibilities in this new era. To our witnesses, we look forward to hearing from you all. I'll turn now to our able ranking member, Mr. Simpson, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Capter. I was glad to see that we at least mentioned the algal blooms in the opening statement. I know that's a passion of yours. Thank you, Chairwoman Capter. I'd like to echo your welcome to our witnesses. We thank you all for being here this morning and look forward to hearing your testimony and engaging in a productive discussion of the Department of Energy's role in addressing climate change. First, let me address one of the biggest climate change straw man arguments. Members of Congress and stakeholders across the political spectrum can acknowledge that climate change is real and that industrial emissions around the globe are contributing to it without concluding that big government command and control schemes like the Green New Deal are the solution. In fact, such proposals would harm the American economy, boost our economic competitors such as China, and quite likely lead to increased global emissions. Instead, real solutions will involve innovation in clean energy technology. The United States can continue to grow our economy and provide good-paying jobs to hardworking Americans by being at the forefront of improving current clean energy technology and developing new technologies. This subcommittee and the Department of Energy programs it funds have been pursuing bipartisan climate change solutions for decades now and have numerous successes to show for it. For example, U.S. emissions have dropped by historic amounts over the past decade or so. One of, if not the single largest contributor to that decline has been the shale gas revolution. Abundant supply produced economically has allowed energy to be provided with fewer emissions and at a lower cost to consumers. What enabled the shale gas revolution? Technology innovations such as the diamond head drill bit stemming from the Department of Energy Research and Development. The U.S. leads the world in clean energy R&D investment. We must continue to make smart, targeted investments in clean energy R&D so that we can provide the world with affordable, reliable, clean energy solutions. Doing so will benefit the American economy while providing the best path forward for addressing climate change. One area of focus right now is energy storage, which is necessary to better incorporate variable energy sources like wind and solar into the electrical grid. And in fact, there's a project in my district, the Cat Creek Energy Storage Project, that Doug Jones here is from Idaho, could tell you all about. It has an innovative public-private partnership that has the potential to improve grid security across the West and provide needed new off-stream water storage to our growing Boise Valley. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses about the successes of past investments and the promise of new investments, both in continuing to improve current technologies as well as ensuring that the United States will continue to be a leader in developing new energy technologies. Again, I thank Chairwoman Capter for calling this hearing and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Congressman Simpson, and I'm very excited that we have such a stellar panel joining us here today. First, we will have Mayor Vi Lyles of Charlotte, North Carolina. Mayor Lyles has been a leader in addressing climate change at the local level, where leadership is so desperately needed, adopting a strategic energy action plan for the city of Charlotte. She is also a constituent of our dear, hardworking, and insightful Representative Alma Adams, who is here today to introduce her. I yield 2 minutes to Representative Adams.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Capter. Thank you to the committee for having me today. I am so very proud to have the privilege of introducing my mayor, Mayor Vi Lyles of Charlotte, the Queen City. In 2016, Mayor Lyles became the first African-American woman ever elected to serve as mayor of Charlotte. Before being elected as mayor, she spent almost 3 decades in public service working for the city of Charlotte, serving 2 consecutive terms as a member of the Charlotte City Council. Her decades of leadership, from budget analyst to mayor, have helped mold Charlotte into one of the fastest-growing cities in America and a beacon of progress and growth in the South. Today, Charlotte is a tech, banking, and entrepreneurship hub and welcomes 100 new Charlotteans every day. Mayor Lyles has also led Charlotte's innovative and ambitious plan to ensure that our city is at the forefront of the fight against climate change. In 2018, our city council unanimously supported a plan to make Charlotte a low-carbon city by 2050 and to set an aggressive goal for reducing citywide greenhouse gas emission levels. Additionally, under Mayor Lyles, Charlotte has launched an initiative to become a zero-waste city and was named winner of the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge. Thank you, Mayor Lyles, for your work and the city's work to combat climate change, to reduce carbon emissions, and to invest in green technologies. We welcome you, Mayor Lyles, and we look forward to hearing more about the important work that you're doing and how Congress can further support your efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, my mayor, Mayor Lyles.
Thank you very, very much, Congresswoman Adams, and I know you had to change your schedule to be here, and I thank you so very, very much for that. We are going to introduce all of the witnesses, and then we will proceed with the mayor's testimony. Next, we will have Mr. Rich Powell, the Executive Director of ClearPath and ClearPath Action. Mr. Powell has also served as a member of the 2019 Advisory Committee to the Export-Import Bank and was previously with McKinsey & Company in the energy and sustainability practices. Following that, we will have Bob Keith, the Executive Director of Environmental Entrepreneurs, or E2. E2 recently released a report highlighting the economic benefits of addressing climate change. Bob has spent more than 20 years as a political, business, and environmental journalist. And finally, we welcome back a preeminent scientist, innovator, diplomat, Dr. Ernest Moniz. Dr. Moniz was formerly the Secretary of Energy in President Obama's administration. His accomplishments and accolades are well known, and we are very fortunate to have him today. Again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. Without objection, your written statements will be entered into the record. Please feel free to summarize your remarks in about 5 minutes each, starting with Mayor Lyles.
Thank you very much. Okay, there we are. First of all, good morning, and really, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come here. I'm especially honored to be joined by the preeminent climate addressers, people that are doing all of this great work. The invitation to come and talk about our city and what we're doing to address climate change is one that we don't take lightly. We're doing all that we can to create a resilient city and be a model for economic and environmental sustainability. I want to tell you a little bit about our city. We're one of the top 5 fastest growing large cities in the past 2 years in the country, and Charlotte is only one of 3 cities in our country that has grown by double digits since the decade of 1960. Our population has doubled to almost 900,000 residents, and we're now the 16th largest city in the country. You know, we are welcoming all of the new residents that Representative Adams talked about, those 100 new people coming every day. And I've been told that they bring 1.6 cars for every visitor that comes or every resident that comes. But we're adding jobs. We added 15,000 jobs last year and another 12,000 jobs this year. And most of our new jobs are in the realm of tech. Charlotte's been recently named as the fastest growing tech talent market 2 years in a row. But today, as mayor, the way I see Charlotte, it's a destination for families and young people who want to have a great place to live. We often talk about being a livable city. And we have grown really, really well, and we're very fortunate, and we recognize that. But more importantly, we also recognize there are certain challenges that come with growth. And I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, we've realized that we had 2 choices. We can embrace the reality that long-term plans are needed to change the way we consume energy, or we could keep what we're doing and leave it to the next generation to figure out, and maybe it would be too late to do that. So we made a conscious choice that we were going to change the course of Charlotte history, that we were going to do something and not leave it to our grandchildren to have to resolve. So as Congresswoman Adams said, our city voted unanimously for the Sustainable and Resilient Charlotte Resolution by 2050. The resolution states that we will strive to source 100% of our energy use from zero carbon sources and to become a low carbon city by 2050, bringing citywide greenhouse gas emissions to below 2 tons per person annually. Then we adopted the city's first strategic energy action plan, Because as mayor, you know that you can have resolutions all day long, but unless you put some feet behind it, it doesn't really work. So we have a framework to guide our transition to a low-carbon future. We want to thank Mayor Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies, who named Charlotte as a winner of the American Cities Challenge, because that has allowed us to launch a bold and innovative vision called Circular Charlotte to become a zero-waste city and to turn $100 million worth of annual waste, to reclaim it so that we can have a great economy and create additional jobs. You know, this benefits us because we are looking at our landfills and our highways, and we need to do something about it. We're excited to leverage our state university, UNC Charlotte, and the many entrepreneurs that are growing from that university's research section. But we know that real change requires everything of everyone, that we have to look at what we're currently doing, and we have to try to change. And we've started doing that. We've taken immediate action now, completing energy audits for over 1 million square feet, including and starting with our cultural facilities, some of the best in our country, I hope. And we want to determine retrofits that reduce building energy usage. We're embedding sustainability into our comprehensive land use plan that we call the Charlotte of the Future in 2040. We're launching a green workforce development program to train individuals in building efficiency, solar energy, and other emerging technologies. We're investing in our public transportation network and electric vehicles for our city fleet. And our airport had just invested in 5 electric buses. We're particularly proud of our work with the private sector and being accepted into the Duke Energy Green Source Advantage program, a renewable energy program for North Carolina customers who want to support renewable resources. We think that if we can work with this program, that it will equate to moving 12,000 passenger vehicles from the roads annually in our city. We know that 61% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation and buildings. So if you really want to help us do better, here are some of the things that we need. So I second many of those that the chair has mentioned. We need more money in research for renewable energies. We need money to retrofit our existing facilities. We need funding for electric vehicles, especially for our buses. We need infrastructure money to make choices that we can have that will make a difference. We need support for mass transit, and we need support for our light rail system. Last week, Greta Thunberg came to our city, and she spoke on our Government Center Plaza, energizing thousands of young people to address climate change. Well, that's great, but we need to address it now. Our young people are holding us accountable, and we should be accountable. Charlotte's a great city, and it's a livable city, but we must make changes to make it a city that everyone can continue to see. You know, cars generate 36% of our bad air. We have to have mass transit. We have to have a better bus system. All of those things are essential to us continuing to be a city that we'd all like to see. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my city, my representative, and all of our governing officials to represent Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mayor Lyles, and also congratulations on your reelection. I want to thank Congresswoman Adams for making special efforts to be here today and to accompany you today. We will now move to Mr. Keith. If you could begin your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I really appreciate you letting me be here with you in this august group on this side of the table. I am Bob Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of E2, Environmental Entrepreneurs. We are a national, nonpartisan group of business owners, investors, and others who advocate for policies that are good for our economy and good for our environment. E2's more than 7,000 members and supporters have founded or funded more than 2,500 companies, created about 600,000 jobs, and collectively control about $100 billion in private and venture equity capital. And those members, by the way, include executives, founders, and funders of clean energy companies that are making energy cleaner, more abundant, and less expensive in America. And in doing so, they're helping our country reduce greenhouse gas emissions that worsen the impacts, including the economic impacts, by the way, of climate change. Now, they're also driving economic growth, and they're creating millions of good-paying jobs, which you can see on the screen right there, that can't be outsourced or shipped overseas. We know this because E2 for years now, in connection with EFI and other partners, have been tracking clean energy job growth all across the country down to the state, city, county, congressional, legislative district levels. Our most recent Clean Jobs America report, which I've submitted for the record, shows us that more than 3.3 million Americans work in clean energy today. And as the chairwoman mentioned, nearly 2.3 million of those are in energy efficiency. And many of those jobs rely on energy efficiency standards, other programs from DOE. For frame of reference, 3.3 million jobs, as the chair mentioned, is more than there are waiters and waitresses in America. It's more than there are people in real estate. It's more than there are people in agriculture in our country. It's more than the people in investment banking. And by the way, it's more than double the number of Americans who now work in fossil fuels. What we also know is that many of these jobs and the climate and environmental benefits that come with them simply wouldn't exist without crucial DOE programs. Let me give you a couple of examples. A few weeks ago, I was fortunate to be in the chair's home state of Ohio visiting the headquarters of an E2 member, Steve Malink. Steve's 100-employee company designs and supplies clean energy solutions, solar, energy efficiency, big range hoods, things like that, geothermal, to companies like hotel chains and restaurant chains that you would recognize, and factories all across America. Now, Steve's an expert in this stuff, and he tells me that geothermal HVAC systems are the most energy-efficient heating and cooling systems known to exist. I'd asked Dr. Moniz if that's true or not, but that's what I heard.
Bought one last year.
Oh, great. The other thing I understand is that they're pretty expensive, at least initially, and they're hard to install. But thanks to a Department of Energy Small Business Innovation Research grant, a SEBR grant, Malink Corporation is about to introduce new technology that could dramatically reduce the costs, substantially increase the adoption of geothermal in our country, saving money for those big users that I mentioned, while also reducing their and our country's carbon emissions. Steve's company is already growing. When I was there a couple weeks ago, he's building a brand new headquarters building and expects to hire a bunch of new employees as this comes to market. Let me give you another example. We have an E2 member named Michael Rucker who started 2 clean energy companies in the past 5 years. He's a wind energy exec. He's created about 250 jobs across the country. Michael's current company, Scout Clean Energy, is developing major wind projects in over a dozen states. In Washington State, for example, I think in Congressman Newhouse's district, Scout is building the Horse Haven project, which is expected to generate 500 megawatts of power by 2022. But behind every one of those wind turbines that Michael's company is erecting is some of the most advanced wind energy technology available. Technology that probably would not exist, by the way, without DOE clean energy programs. Scout now is planning to install storage systems, aka batteries, with its wind projects that will allow it to produce and distribute clean, emissions-free, renewable energy even when the wind isn't blowing, kind of the holy grail in the wind industry. And that wouldn't be possible without the technology and the companies that exist in part because of DOE programs. Lastly, I want to mention to you the companies and the jobs of America's future. You'll find them at clean tech incubators and within the portfolios of clean tech investment groups in all of your states and many others. You'll find them working and emerging from places like the Idaho National Labs and the Oak Ridge National Labs. Not long ago, a group of clean tech incubator CEOs and I met with members of Congress like you all, including some of you all, I think, to talk about the consequences of cutting DOE funding, the same issue that we're addressing here today. What they said was this: without DOE programs, hundreds of promising companies in their incubators developing the next generation of energy technology in America simply would not exist, nor would the jobs, the climate, the environmental benefits that come with that. So in summary, DOE clean energy programs, they're vital to innovation. They're vital to investment. They're vital to competitiveness, and they're vital to jobs in America. They're also a critical tool we can use and that we desperately need in the fight against climate change. E2 and its members strongly encourage you to continue the leadership this panel has shown and aggressively funding DOE's applied science offices and programs, and we strongly encourage you to do that not just for the good of our environment, but for the good of our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keefe, and it isn't every day that Americans get to work on embracing the future, and I think this is such a positive panel, and thank you all for what you're devoting your lives to. Mr. Powell, we're going to turn to you now. Please begin.
Good morning, Chairwoman Kaptur, Ranking Member Simpson, and members of the committee. My name is Rich Powell. I lead ClearPath, a nonprofit advancing conservative policies that accelerate clean energy globally. ClearPath, I'm proud to say, was founded in Charlotte, and we are proud sponsors of the Clean America Jobs Act. One note, we accept no funding from industry. First, congratulations on your remarkable bipartisan accomplishments in clean innovation over the past 2 fiscal years. The new resources this committee injected into the world's greatest peacetime R&D engine, the Department of Energy, are catalyzing breakthroughs. The FY 2020 bills continue this momentum. This committee's efforts do not garner the attention and deep appreciation they merit. Your work is essential to tackling this global problem quickly and affordably. Given this committee's vital role in American climate policy, a few topics today. First, how the global nature of the climate challenge requires an innovation-focused policy. Second, how scaling up America's innovations means more investing than spending. And third, how we might modernize our innovation engine towards the climate challenge. At the outset, the elephant in the room. Climate change is a wicked problem caused by global industrial activity. From the harmful algae blooms in Lake Erie to the pine beetle infestations in Idaho, the increasingly painful costs make it clear. Climate change merits significant action at every level of government and the private sector. On DOE's role, we must first acknowledge the global nature of this challenge. An American molecule of CO2 has the same effect as a molecule emitted in Nigeria. Even if the U.S. eliminated all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the growth in CO2 through 2050 by developing Asian countries alone would exceed our cuts. I do not make this point to minimize the American role in the global solution or argue that aggressive domestic action is unnecessary. Just the opposite. We must develop the U.S. as a test bed for globally relevant clean solutions, using U.S. climate policy to help developing nations easily choose clean energy. As this chart shows, the share of global energy supplied by clean sources has not increased over decades. Despite significant renewables deployment, clean is not gaining ground. Emissions continue increasing. Technologies available today are simply not up to the task of global decarbonization. The great philosopher Stephen Covey offers us the clearest path to solving tough problems. Begin with the end in mind. On climate change, our end ought to be changing this story for developing countries. We need more clean, affordable, reliable, exportable offerings so developing nations consistently choose them over higher emitting options. Leveraging our world-class national labs, America is uniquely suited to seize this immense economic opportunity. How? We must reorient our climate policy mindset from spending to investing. We cannot spend our way to this end. The global energy system is too large, our budget too small. Rather, we must invest scarce tax dollars into clean innovations the global economy chooses on their economic merits. The DOE has successfully invested when it has clearly articulated goals and aligned management and funding all the way from the Secretary's desk to the scientist's bench. See DOE's success in unlocking shale gas and radically reducing the cost of photovoltaic solar. This committee and DOE leadership have provided fresh proof points. You urged DOE to launch a moonshot on energy storage. Earlier this year, they commenced the Advanced Energy Storage Initiative with key technology and performance cost objectives. In FY 2018, you urged DOE to plan for multiple advanced reactor demonstrations within a decade. This year's Senate committee-reported bill proposes an advanced reactor demonstration program to launch 2 prototypes by 2025. This committee's funding for the National Reactor Innovation Center will help make the demonstration program a success. These are examples of investing, not just spending. They leverage the precious federal funds into globally relevant solutions. Such wise investments are the very definition of a market-based solution to climate change, enlisting markets themselves to distribute clean energy. Lastly, I encourage the committee to think well beyond FY20. The precursors of DOE were created in a time of national emergency, with the Manhattan Project sites evolving into the first national laboratories. Over the following decades, the labs were reimagined to solve national energy scarcity. Such daunting endeavors are now in DOE's DNA. Today, we confront a very different opportunity: how to make all of our increasingly abundant energy options clean. To seize this, I urge you to reimagine the mission and structure of the department towards making all energy clean. A modern department should expand and reorient to cover all emitting sectors. We've made enormous strides on reducing power emissions, but lag far behind on transportation, industry, and buildings. A future DOE might build offices for each. Beyond DOE's structure, we have learned a great deal about how to attract, retain, organize, and motivate world-class innovation talent from ARPA-E. A future DOE might expand the innovative ARPA-E people model. There is no question that these structural changes are difficult, but the climate challenge requires that we explore every possible option and take bold action. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify and for your bipartisan leadership. ClearPath is eager to assist the committee in your important work.
Thank you so very much for your very constructive proposals, Mr. Powell. And we are now going to move to Secretary Moniz. Please begin.
Thank you, Chairwoman Capter and Ranking Member Simpson and members of the committee for the opportunity to join you. Thank you. To join you today about the role of DOE in addressing climate change. Let me deliver the punchline up front. The scale and pace needed for the low-carbon energy transition, which is underway, have come to be understood as much greater than was put forward just 4 years ago at the Paris COP21 meeting. And DOE stands at the center of the energy, science, and technology innovation solutions that will position the U.S. for economic, environmental, and security success in that transition. My testimony will draw heavily from the data and analysis-based work at the Energy Futures Initiative, or EFI, that I established with 2 colleagues in mid-2017. We believe it is possible to build a secure, affordable, low-carbon energy future through the power of clean energy innovation and policies based on independent, unbiased, fact-based energy analysis. We do not indulge in magical thinking about either the problem or the solutions. Our approach is framed by what we termed the Green Real Deal. There's a slide up there on that. The Green Real Deal offers a pragmatic approach to reaching deep decarbonization while addressing social equity as fast as is technically, socially, and politically feasible. There are 5 broad principles. Technology, business model, and policy innovation are essential. Broad and inclusive coalitions must be built. Social equity is essential for success. All greenhouse gas emitting sectors must be addressed in climate solutions, not just electricity. Optionality and flexibility are needed for technologies, policies, and investments. We then organize around 8 work elements. I'll just mention 2 of them. The need to understand and develop a workforce for the clean energy future, and the importance of looking at low-carbon pathways in the city, state, and regional context, since low-carbon solutions will look very different locationally within our country and in other countries. With regard to workforce, with 2 of our partners to my left, as well as NASIO, 2 well-regarded surveys of energy jobs in the United States, following on 2 earlier DOE surveys, have come out. We believe this is an important foundation for policymaking and should be institutionalized within the government. That is, understanding the workforce in energy. With regard to a regional perspective, a study of California's low-carbon pathways carried out at EFI is illustrative. The figure shows 33 technology pathways, don't try to read them all, across all sectors. This reinforces Mr. Powell's point. We must address all sectors if we are to reach goals, and that certainly is true for California. The numbers you see are the millions of tons of CO2 equivalent emissions that we concluded could be eliminated for each of these pathways by 2030, when California has a statutory economy-wide 40% reduction requirement. And this kind of analysis can guide solutions. For example, just looking at this in more detail, we can see that success, again, depends upon success in multiple sectors, including some that are very hard to decarbonize. Secondly, one sees here that pathways like auto efficiency actually is the biggest single opportunity for California. Third, somewhat to our surprise, in carrying out the analysis, we found that carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, from both NGCC plants and from industrial facilities together can get the state to nearly 20% of its goal. However, regrettably, there's very little progress, frankly, being made in California on CCS, and yet there is a time urgency to take advantage of the 45Q tax credits passed by Congress in bipartisan fashion. So an all-of-the-above approach is needed, and this is a California and a national imperative. The California study also pointed out the importance of data for planning. Sometimes data is inconvenient, but it really deserves being looked at. For example, in 2017, looking hour by hour across the entire year, we found that a quarter of the days in that year in California, there was little to no wind statewide, and as many as 10 days in a row without appreciable wind. And the picture, by the way, is very similar in Texas, for example. Solar and wind production in California were also double in the summer compared to the winter. These facts illustrate a system based heavily on these resources will require large-scale storage at all time scales, from hours to seasons, and that will not be accomplished by batteries. It's just one example of the need for a strong emphasis on a broad innovation program. We simply can't get to net zero by mid-century without breakthroughs in our innovation approach. Another high-priority breakthrough example, not often discussed, is carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere and perhaps the oceans. This can be done naturally, like planting trees, technologically, like direct air capture, and through technologically enhanced natural processes, like accelerated mineralization. Basalt, by the way, in the Northwest and the Southeast are good examples. Deep-rooted plants, so changing plants, etc. At EFI, we developed a extensive RD&D portfolio for multiple pathways in carbon dioxide removal, with resource needs of about $10.7 billion over 10 years, including $2 billion towards cost-shared demonstration projects. DOE, under this committee's responsibility, would be responsible, we estimate, for 55% of the R&D agenda, with USDA, NOAA, and NSF playing lesser but still major roles. So such an investment could easily make the difference between success and failure in reaching our 2050 net zero goals, and the committee can provide leadership in this domain given the critical role of DOE in that program. Which takes us to more extensively DOE's role. In my last year as secretary, we determined that DOE was responsible for about 3/4 of the entire federal government's clean energy innovation program. So DOE is central, but it's also central, we want to emphasize in closing, across the entire clean energy innovation system, from basic research to deployment. First, it's sometimes overlooked that DOE provides an unparalleled array of cutting-edge experimental and computational facilities available to the entire American research community through its extraordinary system of 17 national labs, at last count serving about 30,000 American scientists and engineers. For energy researchers, for example, the National Lab light sources and neutron sources are absolutely essential for discovering new materials that can drive energy technology breakthroughs. For nuclear energy, the Idaho reactors and associated facilities allow development of new fuels, for example, with enhanced safety. Plant genomics facilities in the national labs, critical for biofuels, and much more. So these are foundational capabilities for an enormous range of energy science. But then, of course, there is a set of programs and facilities and early-stage companies targeted specifically for energy innovation. For example, the Energy Frontier Research Centers, 36 in 34 states and D.C., each attacking a fundamental science challenge critical for an advanced energy technology. And I might say, without detail, an excellent example of crossing administrations where the Bush administration really provided the structure and the Obama administration provided the implementation with an ARA kickstart. But the number of EFRCs, despite their success, has actually gone down since the beginning of the program. Taking a step further along the innovation chain, ARPA-E, the next slide, please, helping in the precarious, high-risk transition from lab to company. Since 2009, around $2 billion over 10 years on around 800 projects, producing 76 companies, 346 patents, with 145 projects attracting about $3 billion of private funding. A great success. But the National Academy of Sciences called for a $1 billion program, and we're not close to that yet. Taking another big step along the innovation chain, the DOE loan program, by any private sector metric, a highly successful program to move technologies over the last hurdle towards deployment. A tremendous ratio of capital deployed to success at this stage, with singular successes such as seeding the utility-scale PV industry and then appropriately leaving the scene in favor of private investors. $40 billion of remaining authority. Let's use it to pursue the energy infrastructure developments that the President and most of us agree upon, and leverage that into maybe $100 billion of energy infrastructure investment. So support across the innovation chain is happening, it's successful, we should support it. In conclusion, Congress has been committed to advancing the American energy innovation agenda over the last several years, but I ask that the pace be picked up further through, of course, through appropriations and other mechanisms that could be supplementary. Our climate needs it, our economy needs it, our security needs it, and I look forward to discussions with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and thanks to all of you. And I want to thank all of the members who've come today. What a tremendous turnout with respect to you, but also to the issue that we are discussing. Since it's been a little while since our last hearing, I just wanted to remind members about our hearing rules. For those members present in the room when I gavelled in at the beginning of the hearing, I will recognize you for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority until all who arrive prior to the gavel have asked questions. And for those who arrived after the hearing started, I will recognize those members solely in order of arrival, again, alternating between majority and minority. Lastly, I intend to observe the 5-minute rule for questions if we can, and answers as well. We'll now begin with questioning under our normal rules. I will just ask one question to allow other members to ask, but I will ask the panelists to remain for a while afterwards so we can get all questions in. I want to start with Mayor Lyles. Can you discuss a little about the impacts that Charlotte expects to see from climate change and how that has affected the programmatic implementation you discussed this morning? I also wanted to ask if you could provide for the record the resolution and the plan, a summary plan that you mentioned, and also the zero waste proposal. Would you be able to make that available to our record?
Yes, thank you so much for asking, and we would be able to do that, yes.
Thank you very much. Could you please discuss the impacts that Charlotte expects to see or is already seeing from climate change, and also how that has influenced what you are doing in Charlotte?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. You know, the impact of climate change I think, really hits us at home. When we talk about the health of our residents, allergies, asthma, all of those things are very real when we have air problems, especially in the times, because Charlotte, often during the summer, with lots of cars and lots of trucking equipment and things like that, that truly makes a difference. And we have had days where we have had to suggest that people stay inside their homes. Now, that's just not acceptable. The other thing that we see is as we continue to grow, we're a southern city, so we tended to grow with a great deal of sprawl. And as we've had that great deal of sprawl, it's been beautiful because it gives people, our residents, choices about where they want to live. But when they have those choices, we've then got to react with getting them the ability to move around our city. And that means that we have to have a bus system that works and a rail system that works. Otherwise, we're just going to have cars clogging roads. And I have to agree with the Secretary. When we think about this, it can't just be about one thing. It has to overlay every aspect of what we do. So if we agree that we're going to have development, then we have to agree that we're going to have a different way of funding transportation. And so those are the kinds of trade-offs we have to make. But we are working really hard on maintaining and growing a tree canopy. We're putting that in our development plans. We're actually having to work with developers to say, we will save our trees, because we know that that's a part of what we have to do. We're also embarking on a new 26-mile rail system. And when we're doing that, we're creating zoning districts that allow for more density around that so that we can have people have choices that they will not have to get into a car. If I could wave a magic wand in our city, I would actually reduce the number of cars that we have, because traffic congestion means greenhouse gases, and it means that we will have bad air for all of our children, and that creates public health issues. So that's what we really understand, that it's not just the responsibility of one area of work. It's where we plan on transportation, how we plan development, and how do we ensure that the quality of life continues for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ranking Member Simpson?
Thank you all for being here and for your testimony. It almost seems like an overwhelming problem that we're trying to address. And I don't know that there's anybody here, or I've never met anybody in Congress anyway, that denies the fact that the climate is changing and that there's an impact that we need to address. Government certainly has a role in it. Private sector certainly has a role in this. And trying to pair those two together is sometimes difficult. And what we do here in this committee is fund a little bit of everything, I guess. And I've wondered in the past what the results of that is, and if there's a better way to address our funding of these various programs that are out there, and how do we involve the private sector in that. Mr. Powell, in your testimony, you mentioned a moonshot strategy to demonstrate multiple new American reactor concepts in the next decade. And as you know, the Idaho National Laboratory recently launched the National Reactor Innovation Center, or NREC, which will provide private sector technology developers support to accelerate the testing and demonstration of new nuclear systems for eventual licensing and commercialization. How would the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that you mentioned in your testimony complement the work at NREC, and how can NREC help amplify the impact of a demonstration program in commercializing the next generation of advanced reactors? And along that same line, for you and Secretary Moniz, our national labs play a significant role in U.S. leadership in clean energy R&D, and especially when they work collaboratively with the private sector. How are there specific suggestions on how we might make our national laboratories even more accessible to private sector development? Because there's always been kind of a break there for some reason. It's called the Valley of Death. And how do we address that?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for your leadership on nuclear innovation. INL is an amazing center of excellence in the global nuclear industry, and so much of the global breakthroughs on civilian nuclear power have come through that remarkable facility. So I think that the two programs you mentioned are perfect examples of different and complementary approaches to working with the private sector on scaling up really difficult new clean energy technologies. So the NRIC, I think, can somewhat crudely be thought of as a WeWork for nuclear energy, right? It's very difficult if you're a young nuclear entrepreneur with an idea for a new reactor or a new design. That's not the kind of thing you can scale up in a garage. None of us want that to be scaled up in a garage, right? You need a specialized facility with specialized equipment like the versatile test reactor, which you've already started to fund and to start to plan and design to build at the NRIC. You need a center where nuclear innovators can come, test their designs, use all of the facilities of the labs, to your second question. But at some point, we also need to decide to go further with some of those designs, right? It's very, very difficult on something as large scale as a new nuclear reactor to, even using all the facilities of the labs, go all the way to demonstration with private capital alone. There's so much risk, right? Take a look at, Bill Gates' nuclear startup TerraPower. Even with all of their resources, they've said repeatedly that they would need some government co-investment in it in order to scale up that technology. And that's, I think, where the moonshot goals come in. At some point, we need a mechanism, a rational mechanism, not only applied to nuclear, we think applied to many different energy technologies, which would select not just one, but a few designs and use a dedicated program of basic and applied research and cost shares with private industry in order to make real targets and demonstrate those technologies. So I think that, the case of the advanced reactor demonstration goals, right? Let's get 2 of these things up and running by 2025, a very aggressive kind of a moonshot, but realistically the sort of timeline we need to be hitting if advanced reactors are going to play a role in decarbonizing a large part of the power grid by the 2050s. They'll be demonstrated in the middle of the 2020s, scaled up and starting deployment in the middle of the 2030s, and then these things usually take 10 to 15 years to scale up meaningfully around the world. So we need to be setting those kinds of aggressive milestones.
Secretary Moniz?
Let me just add a few points to what Rich has said. First of all, on nuclear specifically, I think we take a step back and say that we have never seen so much innovation in the nuclear sector as we are seeing today, with literally tens of companies out there with private funds moving along advanced concepts, actually in both fission and fusion in the nuclear sphere. But as you said, we have not let's say, found the right key to getting these concepts over the finish line to demonstration. And if we cannot demonstrate some number of, particularly the small modular reactors, then of course we will never know if the dog hunts in terms of the ability to scale up. So that is absolutely critical. I believe that cannot happen without a direct or indirect role of the government in a private sector, private-public partnership approach, and some of those mechanisms have been discussed. I'd be happy to come back and talk about more. But I'd like to go to another, again, to reinforce a point I made in the testimony, that sometimes we forget the very foundation of all of these big, unique, cutting-edge user facilities that are in the national labs across the nation. And I think we need to look at, for example, taking lessons from something like the cyclotron road approach at the Berkeley Laboratory in terms of making the laboratories in the private sector work in service of the private sector innovation system. We need, I believe, I mentioned earlier how regional solutions are so important. I think we need to do more, and part of it would be an authorization, part of it might be an appropriation. We need to see the laboratories used as hubs for regional innovation systems. Frankly, it wasn't so many years ago when that was not viewed as part of their mission. I believe we have to recognize it as part of their mission to develop these regional innovation systems. I would just say that in my last year as secretary in the department, we did have some funding there to get ideas on the table for specific regional innovation funding. Regrettably, I don't believe that those projects have moved forward, and I think that's an example of something that should be reexamined. Finally, and I know this is tough, but we can go back essentially 10 years to where a group like the American Energy Innovation Council, reinforced by others, said, we really are underspending in this innovation budget by factors of 2 or 3. The Congress, frankly, in the face of unrealistic administration budget proposals, has really put us on a track of maybe doubling over 10 years, especially if you look carefully at the trajectory, and that's important. Let me say why it's important. Take now, and I'll end by going back to nuclear as an example. It's much broader than that. As Secretary, I charged my advisory group, CAB, to look at the question, what would it take of federal resources, investments, to really move to getting a Generation 4 technology actually deployed? They came back with a number, let's call it in round numbers, like $1 billion a year. Realistically, you can't do that with the current budget. If you were talking about doubling the budget, now a program can plan for a long-term effort to get over that finish line and get it out. So there are these many different aspects. Together with this kind of a system view, we could do a lot more in terms of regional innovation and private sector progress towards deployment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here. I feel like there's this big disconnect between this town and the rest of the country when it comes to this issue. And when you come from a swing state, you look at a lot of swing state polling. And so I've looked at a lot of Wisconsin, Michigan polling lately, and they asked a bunch of independents, top issue, ran a bunch of issues, 2/3 support for the Green New Deal. Now, I don't know if they know the particulars of the Green New Deal, but what they know is there is a problem that we have to deal with in climate change. And then when I got on this subcommittee, I noticed that we spend 3 times more money on research for NASA than we do for energy, and that just seems to be part of that disconnect. We put on 8.5 kilowatts of solar on our house 3 years ago, and there's nothing like a March or April bill of $7 for your monthly utility bill to, make a big smile on your face. But one of the things was we didn't get the battery storage because the cost was still prohibitive. It wasn't quite there. So my question kind of goes right after what the Secretary was saying, but it's for everyone, which is on the research dollar side, what are the most promising innovations that if they had some research boost, because they need some research boost, could show some potential? I think sometimes it's easier for us, rather than just talking about a dollar amount, what would the money actually be going to that's promising, that shows this is something that with a little push could get us across a finish line of having some real growth in this area? So, open it up to everyone, actually.
Sure. I'm curious to know how my list compares to the Secretary's in particular, but I would say I'll put a few that I think are sort of, lots of things could use more resources, a few that are sort of tragically underfunded and could really be doing a lot more. So energy storage technologies, you all have done an amazing, you virtually doubled support for energy storage technologies in the past 2 fiscal years. We still spend about 1/5 that we do on energy storage as we do on researching new wind technologies, for example, and that seems really quite out of whack, given that wind is already, in some sense, the cheapest new source of energy in the country, and energy storage is far behind, but we know it's necessary to continue wind moving along. That's one that I would really target. I think in the solar space, perovskite solar cells, which are the next generation facilities to come online that could radically reduce the cost of solar energy even further, or is one that's tragically underfunded. I think that the most recent mark maybe brings it up to sort of 10 million or so, but that's compared to a solar budget of more than 200 million, when this is really pretty well acknowledged as the thing to really move solar along. And then I think in the fossil energy space, and this is changing, but I think it's pretty clear we've been under-investing in both industrial carbon capture and in carbon capture on gas-fired power plants. We've traditionally thought of CCS, carbon capture, as a technology for coal plants, and that's absolutely vital to continue that funding, but there's a lot of other sources of CO2 out there that we could be also focusing more time and energy on controlling. That would be my quick list.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, and first of all, we'd be happy to supply to your office a report from the spring of this year called "Looking at the Energy Innovation Landscape." So a lot will be in there. But let me supplement. I'd be happy to, of course, yes. It's measured in kilograms, however. But anyway, but in terms of specific areas, first of all, let me start with the storage again, just to re-emphasize, we should not equate storage to batteries. Batteries are very important for both grid and transportation. But as I said, with those data, for example, from California, batteries do not make a system with reliability and resilience if we have a large dependence on wind and solar. Now, an example of storage, it's often not thought of as storage, but for example, big innovation required, but if we had a system with a large dependence on hydrogen, clean hydrogen, hydrogen could serve all of those sectors and could be a storage medium, for example. So we got to think of storage in a different way for timescales, even up to seasonal. One of my slides, and I'm sure everyone could read every one as they went through, does have a list of some innovation areas. Advanced nuclear reactors was another one, but things like hydrogen, advanced manufacturing technologies, very important. We are only scratching the surface on the integration of what we call platform technologies, big data, AI, additive manufacturing, et cetera, into the energy system. And particularly for the urban environments, that will be important in new services. And I'll just end by reinforcing again the issue of large-scale carbon management, including this carbon dioxide removal agenda. I only gave a couple of examples going through it, but in our report, we have 27 different portfolio elements that we're just not making progress on, and that's a game changer. If we can make this a significant carbon management approach, let's say atmospheric carbon dioxide removal, it just changes the whole game for getting to very, very low carbon. So we'll supply a longer list, but that's a good example, I think.
Thank you.
Congressman, I appreciate the question, if I may. I'd add building efficiency into that. That's a simple one. Right now, buildings emit about 34% of the greenhouse gas emissions in this country. DOE funding for research and development is around 10% for building efficiency. And this can be simple stuff. It can be more complex stuff. There's a company in California, for instance, called Carbon Lighthouse that uses sensors and other equipment to essentially monitor a building real time, like you'd monitor a patient in a hospital, if you will, and can adjust the energy usage in that building real time using that system. Another area, and to build on the Secretary's idea, is I think a little bit, is pumped hydro. I was in Montana a couple of months ago and met with a company that's putting a pumped hydro project in connection with a giant wind farm. I can't begin to explain to you how it works, but it's a great storage system.
Called Gravity.
It's called Gravity. But it's in addition to the storage that we typically think of batteries.
May I just add as a factoid, because maybe it's worth putting in context, follows on what was just said, that this issue of multiple sectors, we love to talk about decarbonizing electricity, and that's very important. But electricity emissions in the United States are about 27%. We got to keep our eye on the 73% as well. So transportation, and not just autos, Class 8 trucks, air travel, et cetera, very high heat requirements for industry. The building sector, can we electrify that entire sector, et cetera? Agriculture, very, very tough. So those are areas, I think, where we need a lot more focus.
Thank you.
I just have to say, this is such an exciting panel. I'm having a very good time. I don't know about anybody else, but we are filming this, and we're going to try to get it out to as many sectors as we can. Congressman Calvert, who knows a whole lot about this, not just in his capacity serving on this subcommittee, but obviously on Interior and his excellent work on Defense.
Translation, I've been here a long time. Thank you. Speaking of transportation sector emissions, and I agree that that's the most profound change we need to make. But thanks to advancements in efficiency and shale gas revolution, emissions from the electric power sector has declined significantly since the early 2000s. For the first time, emissions from transportation have eclipsed emissions from the electric power sector. In my previous role as chairman of the Interior Subcommittee, I focused heavily on ways to reduce emissions from transportation through programs like the Diesel Emissions Reduction and Target Airshed grants. As noted in the several witness testimonies, the path to decarbonization, the transportation sector, especially freight and maritime transportation, is less clear than for power generation or light-duty vehicles. And Mr. Powell, how would a 100% renewable strategy impact efforts to reduce emissions in hard-to-abate sectors like transportation and industry?
Well, first, let me thank you for your long leadership on this very important topic, both here on this committee at Interior, for your co-sponsorship of the BEST Act, which takes on this broader storage question, and to build on the Secretary's point, goes well beyond just batteries and thinks about storage across many different time horizons, including day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, right? Real 24/7, 365 storage. So thank you for your leadership and all of that. I think it's fair to say that a renewables-only strategy in the power sector would do very little to take on some of these much tougher challenges, especially in heavy transportation. First, and to build on the Secretary's point, when we're thinking about storage, that's true not just in the power sector, but also in the transportation sector. We've got to remember it's not just about batteries in transportation either. So electric vehicles appear to be making great strides for light-duty passenger vehicles, but it's very difficult to imagine electric vehicles for heavy-duty freight, for trains, for aviation, for I believe 20% of global emissions, which comes from the global shipping fleet. We're going to have to be thinking about an entirely new set of either extremely energy-dense liquid fuels, like some combination of hydrogen or renewable fuels and biodiesel, or methanol or ammonia. There are lots of different approaches for that. In the heavy shipping space, there may even be a role for advanced small nuclear reactors to power heavy shipping in the same way that it powers so much of the carrier and the submarine fleet. And there are companies actively working on that in shipyards around the world, thinking about whether that could be an option. So we're going to need a whole suite of technologies to take on that challenge, maybe even more so than in power. And I couldn't agree more that trying to think about that as a renewables-only approach is just the wrong place to start.
Well, and I agree, we need to get DOE to focus on innovation to reduce emissions, especially as it relates to transportation, trucks. And I know a number of technologies on the horizon with a potential to transform this, and a lot of those companies are in California. I know Elon Musk wants to do this electric truck. You mentioned it's not quite there yet because of the heavy grades, and let's face it, diesel is a very efficient fuel. And so if there's a way to clean that up and make it more effective, that would certainly, in the short term, have a lot of effect. Speaking of going down the path of moving too soon on unproven technologies, Germany spent an equivalent of $222 billion in renewable energy subsidies, and their emissions are stuck at the 2009 level. So it didn't succeed. They spent all of that money, all that effort, and it didn't work. So what do we learn from this example of Germany's energy policy? I think the whole panel can answer that.
Well, first of all, we have always advocated, and when I was secretary, strongly advocated what we call the all-of-the-above approach. Germany chose not to follow that direction, and I think that's a major part of the issue there. Indeed, as you well know, to make up for the loss, particularly of their nuclear capacity, they've actually introduced additional coal capacity. So I think we need to. I think to me the answer is we need to look broadly at this whole set of options, all of the above, and that will allow regional choices to be made that are fit for purpose. If I may just make one comment back to your first question on transportation, and if one studies that figure on the California pathways, it's in there. For one thing, first of all, this may sound shocking, but emissions in California are 39% transportation. So if you're Willie Sutton, you know where you want to look for the carbon reductions. And one big piece is efficiency, vehicle efficiency, where there's a long way to go yet. Another big piece is electrification, as much as one can. And I would say, by the way, light-duty vehicles, maybe up to Class 6. Look, actually, a lot of progress is being made. Class 8 is tougher nut to crack there. But the piece which we often forget about and is essential for California, and I think much more broadly, is the focus on low-carbon liquid fuels. And that is something that needs really a bigger kickstart. For example, there's been a lot of work being done in terms of drop-in biofuels. It has not made a lot of progress in the kinds of cost reduction that we would need. So there's another example of a game-changing innovation if we can crack that nut.
Well, we spent a lot of money in California, and people in California, our gas. When I left California last week, I paid $4.25 a gallon for regular gasoline.
That's why you're all coming to Idaho.
Yeah, and
Which is why efficiency would be very good.
yeah, efficiency would be very good, or at least, where we can get our price of gasoline down. So if you do buy an electric vehicle in California, you only pay $100 a year registration fee versus paying $4.25 for gallon of gasoline. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to just put a comment on the record. I can remember when Senator Lugar from the state that adjoins Ohio to the west was here, and he said, so the 20th century was all about the hydrocarbon molecule. We are now moving into the 21st, and it's going to be all about unwinding the carbohydrate molecule. I thought that was a good way to explain it to the public, and we are at the very dawn of that age. So when you talk about drop-in fuels, for example, I completely agree that the Department of Agriculture has to be an essential element in any future, along with the finest scientists that we have in all these labs across the country, because we don't really understand, even in terms of plants, what produces the most BTUs, usable BTUs for BTU input into the soil. And so we have a ways to go there. I'm not going to ask a question at this point because I'm going to turn to Congresswoman Frankel, who is such a faithful attendee at all these meetings. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm listening to all this, and I'm optimistic and I'm pessimistic. I'm not sure how to feel about this whole thing. But thank you all for being here. Incidentally, I was a mayor also. I appreciate the mayor being here. So my first question is, what, if anything, do any of you think is the effect of our leaving the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think it's a mixed issue. First of all, the impact to date, at least, has been somewhat mitigated by the stepping up to the plate of mayors, governors, and business executives who, and let me just focus on the business executives as an example. Thousands literally have more or less said we're still in because they are responsible for making decisions with long-term implications, long-term capital outlays, for example, and they can see quite clearly we are going to a low-carbon economy. So that has really helped. State leadership, of course, has been very important. But where the withdrawal from Paris certainly comes in, and I won't even go into the broader issues of, frankly, reliability of the United States in a whole variety of agreements, but just in the climate area, American leadership, as in so many other areas, is absolutely essential. It is not being provided, and the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, of course, is the most obvious indicator of that.
Anybody else want to comment?
Well, as mayor, I'd like to say thank you for the recognition. In Charlotte, when that happened, it just heightened our awareness and our need to move more aggressively towards our own plan, and it is something that our citizens wanted us to do. And that's why the impact of it is likely to be something that we won't deal with, but I want to say the impact of withdrawal made it actually more imperative at the local level for us to begin to do this work.
Thank you for that. So if anybody knows, what actions is our Department of Energy taking in this area of climate change? Yes, sir.
Well, first, thank you for the question and your attention to these issues. Let me first say that I think the broad swath of what's happening at the Department of Energy has actually largely continued apace from the previous administration. So all of these programs working on deep decarbonizing technologies have proceeded, and as I mentioned earlier, new programs are being launched on things like grid-scale energy storage, advanced nuclear, gas with carbon capture, and then in the international space, this department has not only reinvigorated, it has, after a year or two, recommitted to U.S. participation in the Clean Energy Ministerial. So if you think of the UNCCC as sort of the international body that focuses on the problem, the Clean Energy Ministerial is what focuses on the solution. And this administration has argued for the launch of 2 new programs. I actually think one was launched under Secretary Moniz and has sort of really just gotten started, which is a focus on carbon capture at the Clean Energy Ministerial. And then this administration has launched an advanced nuclear focus at the Clean Energy Ministerial as well. So there is continuing cooperation on deployment of clean energy technologies coming out of this department.
That's very good to
If
know.
I could add?
Sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry. May I add
Yes,
to that?
please, of course.
I mean, I agree with what Mr. Powell has said, although on the international front, I do want to emphasize the Mission Innovation Initiative started, wherein there is the CCS, but there are other things that need to be followed up on. For example, Mexico took the initiative to host, along with the United States and Canada, a very interesting project looking at advanced materials production in a novel way. So that's going on. However, I have to say that there are other areas where we need to see perhaps the new secretary, if he is confirmed, pick up the pace and pick up the ball. For example, in the previous administration, the energy efficiency standards that were put forth in an accelerated way are a really big deal. The standards put forward just then are projected to 2030 to account for 30 gigatons of carbon emissions reduction and over $500 billion of reduced consumer bills from the more efficient appliances as they come in up to 2030. Unfortunately, that program is just not going at, shall we say, anything like the same pace. So there are, on the one hand, many of the innovation areas, as Rich said, are moving forward, but other areas really need some attention.
Well, what about the cars in California, that issue?
Well, and in our study, frankly, the biggest single impact that we found for California meeting its 2030 targets would be the existing CAFE standards for efficiency, especially of the light-duty fleet. because the reality is, again, data matters. Today, California has about 30 million light-duty vehicles. In 2030, we gave them credit for reaching their goal of 5 million light-duty EVs on the road. However, the projection for the number of light-duty vehicles in 2030 is 35 million. So it's the same 30 million internal combustion engine vehicles, which is why the efficiency gains would be so important. That's a very, very critical issue in terms of their capacity to meet their goals.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Congressman Newhouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And like you, I'm finding this discussion quite interesting, so thank you all for being here. Madam Mayor, pleasure to have you here. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. I'm glad to see you're doing well, and welcome to our other two panelists for being here this morning. It truly is an important discussion and fraught with, it brings up a lot of good ideas. I had the privilege of going to Houston, Texas, and seeing, I think, the largest CO2 sequestration project in the world, which really, I'd suggest all of you go see that. It's really a fascinating, just opens your eyes to all kinds of possibilities. And then being a farmer, I can't let the agricultural industry take all the brunt for all of our issues. I think we're part of the solution. There's a lot of opportunities in the agricultural industry as well. So I'm looking forward to working with you guys on that. But certainly, as we discuss the role of the Department of Energy in addressing climate change, I think, humbly, I would say that any serious discussion has to include nuclear power. And Mr. Pocan's left, he referenced the Green New Deal. Unfortunately, that doesn't even mention nuclear power. But coming from my part of the world, it's certainly a big part of the way moving forward. Mr. Powell, your testimony, which I was particularly interested in hearing, and I've just got two questions I'll ask real quickly and let you take off. But you highlight the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program and the need to ensure the near-term deployment of advanced reactor designs. I would agree with that. In Central Washington, in my district, which Mr. Moniz, Dr. Moniz, you've been to, it true many times. Yeah, at Tri-Cities, it's a nuclear hub. It truly is. We've got a long history of innovation rooted in the Hanford site. We've got the only nuclear plant in a 9-state area, the Columbia Generating Station. We've got a flourishing and diverse set of nuclear companies and startups building off the work of the scientific and energy pillars such as the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which we're all proud of. But those include Framatome as well as NuScale and many, many others. So in many ways, I think the Tri-Cities is the ideal site for a small nuclear reactor, and so you piqued my attention when you brought that up. So the question is, keeping with the theme of today, does the Department of Energy have the tools and the authority that it truly needs to assist reactors that are approaching commercialization? And if not, what can we do to support those efforts? And then if I could just switch gears, you keep that thought. I also appreciate you highlighting the grid storage launch pad at PNNL, which is, again, is in my district, in your testimony. We're excited to see the lab and really the Tri-Cities play a leading role in this, which brought up several times, is crucial technology in helping to address climate and energy challenges. This grid storage is one of those huge challenges we face. So as you talked about the importance of U.S. leadership in terms of economic opportunity for the country, could you expand on both how this effort can accelerate commercialization of grid-scale technologies, as well as what the federal investments like the launch pad mean to local economies such as the Tri-Cities? So, thank you.
Well, first, thank you for your leadership on this. PNNL and the Tri-Cities are one of the real jewels in the American innovation system.
That's my line. I use that all the time.
Well, I will echo your line. Okay. And the wine's not bad right there in the river either.
Yeah, but thank you for that. Yeah.
So first and foremost, on demonstrating advanced reactors in your region. I just last week actually had the privilege of sitting down with the CEO of Energy Northwest, who, as you know, runs the Columbia Generating Station in your neck of the woods, who is going to run the NuScale first demonstration plant down at the Idaho National Lab, and is very enthusiastic about using the Columbia Generating Station site, which, as folks may recall, was initially conceived of not as a spot to run sort of one big reactor, but actually to run at least 5 big reactors. And so there's a huge amount of infrastructure already there in place, and it makes it in many ways an ideal place for, perhaps NuScale Unit 2 after the first one demonstrated at INL. Who knows, perhaps even ahead of the first one demonstrated at INL. So I think you've got an enthusiastic—
Don't say that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I think a little friendly competition can be good sometimes, but it really is an ideal site for that. It has a community that's enthusiastic about nuclear energy. In terms of the tools to actually do that and make that happen, well, I think that the idea of both the launch pad, the NRIC launch pad at INL would be very helpful in that. The demonstration that's already underway and the DOE's decision to buy some of the power for that first NuScale reactor sets a really interesting precedent, right? Both the Hanford site and PNNL more broadly also consume a lot of electricity, and they could be early purchasers to take some of the units from an SMR that could be sited there. And then new ideas like the NELA proposal that's been floated now, it's been now actually passed out of Senate Energy and Natural Resources and introduced in the House as well, would expand those PPA authorities so that DOE could do 40-year PPAs, which would go a long way to help license those. And it could also, in some cases, for first plants, do them at slightly above market rates. Different committee jurisdiction, I think that would end up in OGR here in the House, but I think another really important tool. And then lastly, having a demonstration program such has been proposed in the Senate, Mark, a really aggressive demonstration program, 2 reactors by 2025, PNNL, Hanford, Columbia Generating Station, something in that region would be a very good spot to site one of the reactors for that program. And as you know, there's quite a few nuclear innovators, more broadly in your state that I think would be, enthusiastic about citing something like that there. On your second question on storage, I think, we're thrilled that PNNL will serve as the launch pad for the Advanced Energy Storage Initiative. PNNL obviously has this amazing track record at thinking of storage beyond just traditional lithium ion batteries. You've made, the great breakthroughs in vanadium flow batteries there, for example. But I think crucially, so many of those technologies that have been innovated at PNNL have struggled to actually survive in the marketplace because we sort of got them right up to early applied research, but then there wasn't a good public-private partnership to bring them the rest of the way and really demonstrate them. And so an example of one of the technologies that has come out of that, the UET company attempting to commercialize those vanadium flow batteries, struggled to find a marketplace here in the U.S. China is actively watching our innovation engine. They've got no problem with demonstration and applied research and public-private partnerships. And so they've actually invested in UET, and they're going to be building the first large-scale installations of that in China as opposed to the United States, which seems to me to be a bit of a tragedy when we're thinking about, trying to capture the economic benefits for these technologies here, and then for us to be the ones selling it to the rest of the world as opposed to China being the ones to leverage our R&D and sell it to the rest of the world.
May I add, Madam Chair?
Yes.
2 points. One is going back to the nuclear issue. I want to, first of all, I endorse what Rich said, in particular about having multiple tools, including purchase power agreements and purchase power agreements with greater authorities, very important. But I want to up the ante. So the word aggressive was used with regard to the Senate bill of 2 reactors by 2025. And from where we are today, perhaps the word aggressive is appropriate. The reality, however, is that I believe that the value proposition, the cost proposition for small modular reactors needs more. It doesn't need just 1 or 2 deployed. It needs enough to have an order book where the investment in tooling and production line investment can be made. So whether that's 5 or 10, we can argue, but I think we need to think bigger in terms of getting out there so that the manufacturability can be understood and the learning curve of manufacturing can be brought into play, the stable workforce Right now, for example, with the reactors being built in Georgia, the large reactors in Georgia, which are almost a factor of 2 over budget, well, you try getting 7,000, 8,000 craft workers for a 7-year project in rural Georgia. So we need to think in that system view. What does it mean to really have an industry built? Secondly, if you will allow me, twice I've heard the words Green New Deal mentioned. Just like to point out, number one, we should not confuse the words put out for Green New Deal with some of the statements made peripherally about what it might mean. In particular, for the energy and climate agenda. I'm not talking, there are many, many agendas in there, but on this agenda item, what we say, there's really only 2 things that are said. 1, we should go to low carbon, and 2, in going to low carbon, we should have social justice concerns in the foreground. Agree with that completely. Now the question is, what is an actual implementable program that respects those principles and moves forward? That's what we called the Green Real Deal that was in my first slide. So that is our way of saying, look, here's how you build a program that respects those 2 principles, and let's move on with it.
Thank you. Congresswoman Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. First, I want to thank you for having this very important hearing. I've been saying for about 25 years we should have a national energy strategy to convert over to renewables. I now, after coming back from China, think that there has to be an international strategy along with that, because this really is an international problem. And it was interesting and disappointing when I was in China to hear from their leaders that they don't feel like our country is taking the lead in infrastructure and renewables. And they see themselves as more taking the lead in that. And so my question is, I've got a couple questions, but my first question is for you, Mr. Secretary. Are you aware of any work right now in developing a national and international energy strategy to convert to renewables?
Well, first of all, I would say the innovation strategy, as we've been discussing it today, is certainly part of that comprehensive strategy. But it's also it's necessary but not sufficient. And there, I think, is where we need to complement the innovation agenda with various policies. For example, some form of carbon pricing would make an enormous difference. Whether it's direct or indirect, one can discuss. For example, actually, maybe it's worth mentioning the well-known Baker-Schultz proposal, which is a carbon price of around $40 to start per ton emitted, with the proceeds, the collections, not staying with the government, but going back as a uniform dividend to the population. I mention that because that combination actually addresses those principles of low carbon and social equity, because the dividend approach favors those with lower on the income distribution. So that's an example. However, if you want a comprehensive strategy, you really need to go to their next statement, is with a carbon price, what do we then eliminate in terms of certain regulations and incentives? And there I say, okay, now it's time to have the real discussion, because $40, for example, would be a technology shifting price for the electricity sector, but probably not for the transportation or industrial sectors. So we will still need to complement carbon prices in that level with a discussion with the Congress about the statutory basis for other policies and regulations. And on that, I have to say, frankly, that discussion has not really begun and needs to.
And that's disappointing. It's an existential threat, internationally and nationally. The Department of Defense has identified it as our top security problem. And yet here we sit with not much really happening. I think we've got a real opportunity in my district to work across the border with Mexico, because we share that border. And if they are not starting to use innovation and renewables, for my district, it doesn't matter. The air doesn't follow borders. It just comes over. So we're seeing all of the effects of that. Yeah, Mr. Powell, can you address that?
Sure. Just generally, I think we spend far too little time thinking about all of the energy development in other countries, which are, at this point, the vast majority of the emissions, and all of the tools that are actually at our disposal. Right? So in the last Congress, the BUILD Act, big, broad, bipartisan bill, right, which converted OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to the new International Development Finance Corporation, that authorizes $60 billion in authorities, much of which could be used to, do smart either lending or equity investments in clean energy development, right, around the rest of the world. Also, we've got to address the problem in OPIC, which is that it uses the World Bank's restriction on financing new nuclear plants. In much of the rest of the world, that might be a really viable, clean, zero-emission new source that we should be building. We should be fixing that at World Bank. We should be making sure that that's part of the IDFC portfolio. And I think that EXIM could play a significant role in that as well.
And can I
yes,
supplement
go ahead,
that?
go ahead.
Because to build on that, what Rich said, and I certainly agree with it, but I also go back to your statement about, for example, the Department of Defense concerns about this. We are not taking an integrated view, not only about, let's say, energy innovation and energy policy, but national security policy, foreign policy. For example, we like to complain and wring our hands about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which includes, especially in Southeast Asia, the construction of lots and lots of coal plants. Well, instead of wringing our hands, why don't we just compete? Which is what Rich is saying. And it could be nuclear, it could be renewables, it could be natural gas, which is certainly better than coal. But we can't compete without those kinds of mechanisms in place. So obviously, this committee has a particular jurisdiction, but as members of Congress more broadly, I think integrating those issues is absolutely essential.
I couldn't agree more. We have a nuclear power plant in Arizona. The utility would like to expand it, but they've run into so much public resistance. People are still afraid of nuclear, and so much of this policy has to be educating people about how important this is and how we can do it right now.
And by the way, many of the new plants that are being designed really have extraordinary safety features.
I think, yes, go ahead.
Congresswoman, if I may, to your original question about an international strategy, frankly, I think we did have the foundation of an international strategy in the Paris Agreement. And to Congresswoman Frankel's point, the good news is we're not out of it yet. And thanks to leadership here in Congress and the resolution you all passed earlier this year in the House, we've shown the world that we are still committed to that. We just need to figure out how to stay in that. And that, I think, is a good foundation for the type of international strategy that you're talking about.
Thank you for that comment. I couldn't agree more. I think we can still move ahead in a very meaningful way. And like I said, time is of the essence. So I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Kirkpatrick. And now Congressman Kilmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding a hearing on what I think is one of the most important topics that we will cover. I wanted to start with a question for Mr. Keefe. I chair the New Democrat Coalition. We, earlier this year, put out a set of principles that were focused on really providing a roadmap for big, bold, ambitious action to meet the scientifically mandated goal of an economy-wide net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at the latest. And I want to recognize the valuable role of the research and policy work that you all have done in helping to shape that. One of the core ideas that we focused on is workers, and how do we make sure that they have the skills that they need to succeed in a cleaner energy economy. And I know that E2 put out a Clean Jobs report, and it highlighted that 2/3 of the current jobs in the U.S. clean energy, industrial, construction, and manufacturing sectors. But we have a sense that not all jobs in the clean energy economy can be filled with existing skill sets. So I want to get a sense from you of where do you see opportunities for the existing skilled workforce to transition into clean energy jobs? Where do you see need for potential reskilling or upskilling of existing workers? And give us a little guidance from a public policy standpoint. What should the federal government be doing both for current workers and for that future workforce to make sure that they can succeed in a clean energy economy?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. First of all, I say the good news is that clean energy jobs run the spectrum. They run from the Secretary of the Department of Energy to the folks that are putting insulation in your attic, right? And it's a wide variety of skill sets, which means that these jobs are available to people of all stripes and in all states across the country. As part of our work tracking clean energy jobs and the work that EFI and NASIO has done with the user report, I think we survey something like 35,000 businesses across the country, not just in clean energy, but in things like electricians and roofing companies and appliance makers and things like that, which also work in energy efficiency fields, for instance. And what we found over and over again is that these employers are saying the biggest problem that they have is hiring enough employees. If you talk to people in the wind industry, our friend Mr. Rucker, Michael Rucker, one of our members out in Colorado, he can't hire enough people because they're not skilled up enough. If you look in the solar industry, particularly in certain states, the availability of solar workers is just not there. I think that one solution to that is investment, obviously, in training, and one good place to do that is in community colleges around the country. We're starting to see community colleges and other secondary education institutions start to realize the opportunities here, but they're slow to move. And I don't know what it was like when you were in high school, but we were still learning how to fix lawnmowers. Well, maybe we should be teaching kids how to fix solar panels now instead.
Thank you. Thanks.
May I just add that I certainly agree on the training and the community colleges aspect, and at DOE we did quite a bit of that. But I'd like to also say that we should really think hard about the role of organized labor here. Organized labor knows how to train people to do their jobs. So I think a combination of creating the job opportunities and working with organized labor can also be a very, very effective way to fill those needs.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I wanted to direct a question your way as well. So I'm proud, like Mr. Newhouse, to have a Pacific Northwest National Lab in my district. They support the DOE's only marine lab in my district, and I'm excited to see that the DOE is investing in some of these initiatives like the Hydro Next and the Wave Energy Prize competition to really try to catalyze some of the development in this next generation of marine energy technologies. There is considerable interest from the DOE and from private industry in growing investment in marine energy sources, renewables, marine hydrokinetic energy, biofuels from algae. There's increased public and agency recognition of the critical value that our oceans play to combat climate change. And so with that in mind, I want to get a sense from you of what opportunities do you see for the DOE to increase funding for ocean-based fundamental research and technology development?
Well, first of all, I'd say you've put your finger on a lot of what is being done at frankly, a too low level today, and so I think amplifying that is very important. So there are the technical solutions like hydrokinetic, et cetera, which still have a long way to go in terms of cost effectiveness. I'd like to, however, also note that you mentioned algae, for example, and in our carbon dioxide removal report, we note that there are major opportunities for coastal carbon dioxide removal. A lot of that involves plants in one way or another, organisms. And so I think perhaps with NOAA, really picking up on those coastal opportunities, kind of green water stuff would be a really good place to increase the focus.
Thank you.
And also I should mention that there's another that and earlier the chair mentioned USDA, which clearly is a big player. But I will note that Department of Energy, again through its national lab systems, has enormous capabilities in terms of plant genomics, for example, and in terms of things like computational chemistry, where PNNL was actually a leader. So I think one needs to have a big view and bring the system together. I'd also like to say that I sure would like to see more people west of the Cascades know about PNNL.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I mean, it's a gem in Sequim, Washington. It's not just doing important research, but providing really important jobs. So thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. So I'll tell a story. About 15 years ago, when I was a ranking member on agriculture, and actually it was more than that number of years, but Senator Tom Harkin was over in the Senate, and we cooperated on an amendment in an appropriation bill to try to spawn a biofuels industry out of the Department of Agriculture. And it was a most interesting experience because at that time, agriculture was known for food. They had the 3 Fs, food, fiber, and forestry. So we wanted to give them a fourth leg on the stool, fuel. Oh my goodness. You cannot imagine the resistance. And so today, if you look at the biodiesel industry, if you look at the ethanol industry, now you couldn't take it away from them. But the research in terms of the types of plants, the plant science that we must know in order to be the most efficient at yielding the highest number of BTUs for the number that we invest in trying to get the plant to grow, still doesn't exist in, I think, the highest science that it should. But I wanted to put that on the record because the district that I represent sent the first fighter craft into the air using biodiesel, and it didn't crash. And as we think about, new fuels, I think agriculture has a massive role to play in this. And I've heard what you've said, Mr. Secretary, about the Department of Energy laboratories. But you would have to be God to get the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy to cooperate. Barbara Lee and I have been trying for well over a decade now to try to get them to work together, impossible, to invent a type of climate-controlled, affordable greenhouse that's energy efficient so we could roll it into poor neighborhoods across the world. They can't do it yet. But it's just so hard to get these scientists to cooperate across departmental lines, I have found. I just put that out there as a real experience and one where we see the marketplace moving in the direction of new fuels, and we should be able to get it there faster. There's a biodiesel industry, there's an ethanol industry, but our science is we're still at, gate 1. We're not even at first base. We're not even in terms of where we are on those carbohydrate-based fuels, but we just can't move there fast enough. So if you don't have to give answers now, but if you could provide me with ideas of how to do more along those lines, I really do think not just America, but the world would benefit. I also wanted to suggest looking at the materials that you have provided for the record, which are extensive and we are very grateful. I think one of the problems with the Department of Energy is that it's extremely right-brained, and the ability to communicate to the general public is a stretch. Everyone in this room is an exception. This is something you really understand. This is something you really care about. But if I look over at NASA, they have managed to get the public to imagine about a Moon-Mars landing. We have the first women walking in space. We have Artemis. We have a name. I know that we have the green real deal. I heard what you said this morning. But I think maybe working with Mayor Lyles. I don't know. It seems like we don't have clear goals that the American people can feel, oh, in this community, we have to plant 100,000 trees. Here at this research lab, we do this. I think to take additional steps, there needs to be some kind of industry-wide goal setting that the general, every scout troop can adopt. I think it's hard for the public to, other than purchasing an energy-efficient vehicle, it's very hard for them to participate, and I think they want to. So I'm asking, for the record, if you could give us some suggestions on how to begin, how to do a better job of setting goals that the public, we had talked about Sunshot. I remember, Mr. Secretary, when you were such an able Secretary of Energy. And there, I thought, oh, yeah, that's a name. I take it you want to comment on that. I didn't think you could answer the question fast enough. But I do think somehow we have to get these brilliant people to communicate, as Congressman Simpson and Congresswoman Frankel do so well, with ordinary people so they can gravitate to the goal.
If I may comment, and you mentioned Sunshot, I would just say we had other catchy phrases like in the energy efficiency program, the fridge to the 21st century, back in the Clinton years, et cetera. We had a mine is a terrible thing to waste, but anyway, we could go on with that. But more seriously, you mentioned NASA and the job it does in terms of kind of public education, et cetera, versus the Department of Energy. There actually is something that could, in principle, be done. The mission of educating the public is part of NASA's founding act. Doing that at the Department of Energy is not part of its authorized set of activities. And I cannot tell you how gingerly we would have to approach some of these programs in terms of education, et cetera. So one could assign, I think there are some staff here in the room, to do maybe like a comparative analysis of what the authorities are in those two cases and see how one might go forward there. So that would be a concrete suggestion. And we also did some other things, but they're piecemeal because there is not that kind of authority. For example, here's something that probably nobody knows, that the Department of Energy, and I don't know if it's active, to be honest, today, but it was when I was there because I waved the green flag at a NASCAR race. DOE has an MOU with NASCAR, which led to all NASCAR races, they require 15% ethanol in the fuel. And that's been now in place for quite a few years. So, but again, they're piecemeal as opposed to something integrated, and the ranking member could help us overcome some of those barriers.
I thank you very much for those suggestions. And if anyone else wants to think about those and provide replies to the record, we would be most welcome. Mr. Powell.
I would just add, I think the idea of goal setting is just music to our ears. You know, if you go around the National Laboratory Complex, again, a remarkable set of facilities, at every one you hear a lot about capabilities. We can do anything here. Too often you don't hear about, well, this is specifically what we're working on producing. And I think for many folks, having those clear goals makes it so much easier to justify, okay, we're putting dollars in because we're going to get this specific thing. We're going to get 2 nuclear reactors or, 3 grid-scale storage facilities at a particular price point on a particular timeline. And I think establishing those, I realize that none of these are sexy like landing on the Mars or the Artemis program, but at least they're a step in the right direction of having clarity, which can then be shared with everyone working in the department, with all of the labs. It sort of forces collaboration across the labs, et cetera. I think it's a really good step.
I wanted to thank you very much for that, and I wanted to move to hydrogen just for a moment. I had a fascinating discussion with one of our Japanese diplomats recently, and I said, I come from a huge automotive and truck platform production region, probably the largest one in the country, okay? So I said, hydrogen. I have a dear brother, my only sibling. He's brilliant on mechanics. He told me long ago, Marcy, hydrogen. Hydrogen is where it's headed. We just got to get there. So I said to this Japanese diplomat, knowing they've eaten our lunch in the automotive industry for a long time, what about hydrogen in Japan? Which company? I probably shouldn't say it for the record, but the gentleman picked one of the companies in Japan and said, that's the one that has the lead. But then he went, but we're not really in the lead. China is. Hydrogen and motor vehicles. So my question is, if we're not in the lead, and even if Japan's not in the lead now, how do we catch up and surpass in terms of hydrogen and vehicular transportation?
Well, I'll say a couple things. And by the way, just to add to the story, I would say that Europe is doing a lot more also in an organized way to develop a hydrogen economy than are we. And in addition to Japan and China's work. I would just say that, and I mentioned hydrogen earlier, I think that what we should be looking at and dramatically increasing our level of effort is hydrogen not just for transportation, but as an economy-wide opportunity. Sometimes I would refer to hydrogen as carbonless natural gas, by which I mean that natural gas today is a fuel that is used really economy-wide. It's got so many flexible uses, and hydrogen can be that in a very, very low-carbon world. And I think that's where we should be looking. The hydrogen applications, especially, I think Rich mentioned this earlier, for the heavier transportation fleet, for example, for industry, for process heat, for all kinds of applications. So I think we need a really broad-based, big program on hydrogen. I think it's got enormous potential.
Which of the labs has that mandate?
I don't, to my knowledge, maybe others can correct me, but to my knowledge, there's no specific mandate at any laboratory. And that's an example of what's needed, yeah.
That's really very interesting.
Madam Chair, can I just emphasize
Please,
there?
Mayor.
We have a small group in Mooresville, North Carolina, close to where the racetracks are, but they have been working on hydrogen for a while, and they do all of their work abroad because they've not been able to get traction here in the States. So I think that it's this idea of getting the ability to know that there's a goal, stating a goal, and then stating an accountability for it, then those folks would have an easier path than just saying, I've got an idea, and they're shopping it across the world now, not just in the States. So I really like the idea of Mr. Powell's for, focus on a goal and an accountability, and have people that are really trying to innovate and do things differently know where they can go, at least to get the audience. It doesn't mean that they have the right method right now, but if we miss out on that opportunity when that right method comes, it's a real loss for our country.
Could I also just add one point? Sorry, Bob, let me just add another point on how broad this challenge is, because clearly for a hydrogen economy, infrastructure is a really, really big deal. But if you go to Japan, for example, one should not think that in their heads is just the idea that in a hydrogen economy, you would be sending it around by pipes. It's a possibility, but I know they are working very heavily also on the idea that you move the hydrogen in a liquid, so to make it much easier, and then you release it kind of at the end point, et cetera. And if we don't develop the optionality, we can get locked in to the wrong direction. So that's why we need to have a really broad, comprehensive program, and I agree with the goals, to start getting it out there. Another thing I'll just say is that often in terms of producing hydrogen, many people think just of electrolysis of water. And with innovation, reducing the costs of electrolysis, getting a lot of really low-cost, carbon-free electricity and heat, maybe that is going to be absolutely the future. But we shouldn't forget, at least in a transitional mode, today the cheapest way to make hydrogen, of course, is steam reforming of natural gas, of methane. And you could add to that carbon capture and sequestration and have low-carbon hydrogen. And in different parts of the country, because of their geography and geology, they might take different solutions to make hydrogen. So all of these questions remain out there and not really being addressed.
Thank you. Ranking Member Simpson.
Thank you. It was, when I first got on this committee, I read a book called The Hydrogen Economy. And so that's been 16 years ago or 17 years ago. And I was talking to my uncle, who was a research guy out at the Idaho National Laboratory years ago, long since retired. And he said, you know, we worked on that in the 1950s and 1960s. And the problem was that we were looking at it for transportation, for automobiles and stuff. The materials for a container were so heavy for hydrogen that it just didn't make sense. He said, if you really wanted to put hydrogen to work, what you ought to do is reform the rail industry. It mostly runs on diesel now. He said, because they can carry their own containers, all that kind of stuff. But I want to ask, I'm going to talk for just a minute, if that's okay. I agree, Mayor. We need a transportation system, and it's going to bring challenging as we're getting more and more fuel-efficient automobiles, as we're getting more and more electric vehicles on the road. How are we going to pay for our transportation system? That is an issue that we're going to have to deal with in Congress, a different way of raising the revenue for our transportation system. And I don't have the answer to that, but it's certainly going to be a challenge for all of us. So I appreciate what you're doing, but I've been impressed that local communities and states and private companies are actually the ones taking the lead in a lot of these things. Your community, Boise, Idaho, has decided that by, I think it's 2040 or something like that, they're going to be a completely green community or green energy. Idaho Power has said by 2045 they're going to be, and they're mostly hydropower now, but they also have coal-fired plants. They're going to get rid of the coal-fired plants by 2045. That doesn't mean that they're not going to do anything until 2045. They're going to be moving in that direction and have it completed by 2045. But it's really the private sector and local communities and states that are making the main changes that are driving a lot of the changes that are going on. But all of this is dependent on these changes and the things that you've talked about being cost-effective. Because ultimately, the consumer is not going to go out and say, hey, I'm willing to pay another $50 for a gallon of gas. I'm making that up, whatever. Or are they going to, and you mentioned the new bill that's out there about putting a $40 or $50 carbon tax on and then refunding it to citizens, and that addresses the social justice aspect of it. And I've talked to these people quite a bit, and I get a little nervous when we institute another government program that can be manipulated and everything else. The problem is that that tax goes away as the emissions come down. Start taking away that subsidy you're giving to those people as it comes down, and you've got a real problem. So there are some challenges with that aspect of it. But all of this, and we talk about electric automobiles. I just saw on TV last night at the LA car show, they have the new Mustang, all-electric Mustang. And they were real proud. They were saying, hey, this gets 300 miles for a recharge. That's beautiful if I'm driving around D.C. If I'm driving across Idaho, I'm going to have to stop and recharge it. And that might take an hour, 2 hours, whatever. They're working on trying to reduce the charging times at the Idaho National Laboratory. They'd like to get them down to where it takes about as long as it does to fill up a car. But there are still no charging stations around Idaho. So where am I going to stop halfway between Boise and Idaho Falls and recharge my automobile? So it's different challenges in different parts of the world. But what I really need to know and what I need you all to think about, and these are some really neat things that you're talking about. And I have no doubt that we could implement and mandate a lot of these things that would have significant carbon reductions. But at what cost and at what consumer adaptability or willingness to accept those costs. Right now, we look at our budget, about $45 billion. Seems like a lot of money. It is. About $20 billion of that is in defense. I know, Secretary Mediz, we've had discussions when you were secretary about whether that ought to be there or not. But about $20 billion in defense, about $7 billion in the Army Corps of Engineers, about $1.5 billion in Bureau of Reclamation, throw in another $500 million in other things. We're down to where the Department of Energy that runs 17 national laboratories, does all the research stuff, RPE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, about $13 billion. If we doubled our research and development in this, if we could somehow get the Budget Committee and leadership to go, yeah, you guys need $10 more billion if you're gonna do this, or whatever, or 5, where would we put it? Where it would make the difference? That's what I'm not an energy expert. Where would this committee put it where we could see the results that we would need, that we would get over this Death Valley that you talked about, where we develop these technologies and it gets to a place where it's not yet ready to go to the private sector, or nobody's there to accept it and move it on? And what should our role be in that? I know that's a broad, meaningless question, but if you could address that.
Excuse me, Congressman, if I may. For one thing, I think it would be smart to look at the way that funds are allocated to DOE generally. We've been talking, yes, it's important to look at nuclear, yes, it's important to look at hydrogen, but it's also important to make transportation a priority. It's also important to make building efficiency more broadly a priority, and to fund those types of programs that are going to, frankly, get the most bang out of the buck for a lot of those investments. The other thing I would consider when thinking about costs is that there are two sides of the ledger. And we started this discussion with the quote-unquote elephant in the room, which is climate change. The economic costs of climate change are piling up every single day. It's $17 billion in damage from Hurricane Florence in my home state of North Carolina. It's 50 to 80 billion in fires in California, where I live now. It's tens and 20 billions of flooding in the Midwest. Those are costs that have to be borne somehow as well. And if we can do something on the investment side through DOE programs in these smart areas that are going to reduce carbon and, by the way, also attract more investment, create more jobs, that's a plus on the other side. I'd also suggest that, and Dr. Moniz is more proficient in this than I am, but if you look at the return on the investment from some of DOE's programs, he mentioned ARPA-E, which I think has invested about $2 billion over 10 years and returned $3 billion. That's a pretty good return. Created 70, 80 companies and attracted billions of dollars in private investment. If you look at EERE, as I understand it, EERE has invested $12 billion between 76 and 2015. In return, it's created $388 billion in net economic benefits. That's a rate of return of something around 27, 28%, which is pretty darn good rate of return. So I think we need to look at this investments as an investment in our future and, frankly, in our present, because we need to do this now, and we need to consider the costs that we're confronting on the other side of the ledger as well.
I don't disagree with anything you said. With $13 billion and all of these different things out there, where do you put it? I mean, everybody wants us to. Everybody wants us to fund every different program that they come, and every company comes in and they got a new idea, and we need a little funding and so forth, and it just is never ending. And so we have limited resources. Where do we put it? Yeah.
Can I just say, I think this cost filter is how you make those decisions. And remember, it's not just the cost of deploying it here in the U.S. The Secretary mentioned the China Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of the coal plants that they're building around the world aren't even the best coal plants that China has to offer, right? China has actually an ultra-efficient supercritical coal fleet. In Pakistan, for example, they're building subcritical coal right now because it's cheaper, right? So the developing world if your priority is electrifying your population as quickly as possible, they're going to go to the low-cost option. So for better or for worse, that's got to be the filter for our innovation programs. We have to be looking for each of these major emitting sectors, and of course, nobody has a crystal ball, but we've got some sense. We've got terrific, brilliant people at DOE who do really detailed techno-economic analysis and can at least say, you know, I see some pathway toward this thing getting to cost parity with either here in the U.S. combined cycle natural gas in the power sector, which is kind of the thing to beat, in around the world subcritical coal, in the transportation sector with, you know, with diesel, or in maritime shipping with bunker fuel. You kind of know what the bogey is in each of these different sectors. You can have some sense of which technologies have some pathway to get there on a meaningful timeline, and you can use that to set up, you know, at least your first line filter about what you should fund. EFI has actually done a great work in the breakthrough report earlier this year in sort of taking that and a number of other factors and developing a filter and using that to identify a set of technologies that kind of pass those hurdles. And I really think that the department, and I would say appropriately the committee as well, ought to be adopting something like that, a really formal filter, which is saying that, well, these are the things that, you know, that make sense and have some horizon, and use it to justify some hard choices. There's stuff happening, you know, at the department we probably shouldn't keep investing in, right? If it doesn't have that clear pathway, you know, and pick our time horizon, right? Let's say we're trying to get a fleet of things done in a decade, right? If things have some chance of getting done in a decade, let's put 80% of our resources there. Sure, we should be investing in longer term, riskier things as well. But if you take the climate crisis seriously, we don't have much more than a decade to produce the breakthroughs and then get them scaled up globally, you know, by 2015.
Well, that's kind of what I like about RPE, is that you have to demonstrate progress and that kind of stuff. And I know, Secretary, you want to answer this, but one other thing, could you just explain to me what the hell direct air capture is and how that works?
Okay. Well, that will come at the end of my soliloquy, because it will be natural. But first, I just want to let me reinforce something that Bob said about the cost equation, and that, you know, some don't like the words used, but the words that have been coined are social cost of carbon, and so it's a very imprecise way, a very difficult calculation to make, but kind of in some average sense, the feeling, at least back a few years ago, was some number in the 40s of dollars per ton of CO2 was an appropriate way of looking at that. So it gives you some idea that it's not free in many ways to not put in place policies or incentives that push us towards low carbon. The adaptation costs are one major example of that. And I might say, even that, we can count up how many tens of billions a hurricane cost or the floods in the Midwest cost, et cetera. But how do we add up really here in the United States of America right now in Northern California, people being told you're not going to have electricity for a week? I mean, it's unbelievable. In terms of something that is so central to all of our lives. So we are paying a cost. In fact, I would add that, in my view, I think that the reason there is so much shift in, I think, the public's recognition of the importance of doing something about this, and this may sound not very, I don't know, complimentary of all of us, but I think it's because we have stopped thinking of this only as an issue for our children and grandchildren, as opposed to an issue for us too. It's right now that we're paying the price in not addressing this, while realizing there's no way to flip a switch and suddenly we've resolved the problem. So we've got to have this decadal view going forward and keep turning the ship as fast as we can. Now, I'm going to disagree slightly with, finally we can disagree with something Rich said a little bit. There was the statement that if it can't produce something in 10 years, then we kind of put it out of the portfolio or give it small funding. I would say the opposite. if that was the intent, in the sense that, again, take our, and now I'm coming to your last question, so take this carbon dioxide removal agenda. Clearly, it is not going to scale up and have a major impact until mid-century, but it ain't going to have any impact in mid-century if we don't make a big push now in that budget. So it's all how you manage the portfolio to recognize that, let's say on a decadal timescale, 2030, the impacts we're going to have in 2030 are the things you see today, but improved. I mean, innovation still matters because that's what will keep driving the costs down, which is very, very important, and was your point. But we also can't take our eyes off some of the very fundamental problems that we have to address to have scalability by mid-century. And so that's why the portfolio needs, that's why you need $5 billion more in the budget, or some fraction of that may be combined with something that's not appropriations, but other mechanisms. For as an example, it's now an expired program. It was in place for 8 years. It was a program looking at unconventional gas, et cetera, in which the Congress said that oil and gas a certain fraction of oil and gas royalties would be invested in that program, and the oversight stayed with the department and the Congress, the appropriations, because in many of these kinds of programs, it would identify an alternative funding stream, but each year it still had to be appropriated even though it wasn't counted against the budget caps. So there are creative ways to make a part of that at least. But I do think appropriations need to be increased, as I said earlier. So I believe one of those areas is this carbon dioxide removal, and we'll send you that report as well as the innovation report you asked for earlier. Among the 27 portfolio elements we have is the issue of direct air capture. And, I mean, at some level, it's very similar to carbon capture from the flue gas of a coal plant. It's just that in the flue gas of a coal plant, it's 15% carbon dioxide. In the atmosphere, it's 0.04% CO2. So you got to move a hell of a lot more air through your system to be able to have a comparable amount of capture rate. So that's where cost reduction is very, very important. Getting very low energy, very low cost energy, very low carbon, low cost energy to drive the process will be very important. But by the way, if you're using that direct air capture, congratulations. Let's say you have now captured 2.5 billion tons of CO2. Great. Now you got to figure out what to do with 2.5 billion tons of CO2. If you want to put it all underground, there's pore space, but you will be putting as much underground as the entire oil extraction industry globally today. So you might want to try to find some other things to do with the CO2 as well. Maybe a hybrid system, like use some of your basalt for more mineralization of some of that CO2. Maybe you can convert it into fuels. Big part of the research agenda, the utilization agenda of the CO2. So these are big, big numbers, and we got to get on it and have something that is scalable within a minimum of 3 decades, but hopefully sooner. And so we could go through that, and like the hydrogen, it's another big issue, as I said earlier, with many, many questions. So there are many areas that deserve expansion, like Bob mentioned quite correctly, the whole building technologies issues, and there are other areas that are the potential for big breakthroughs. As Rich mentioned, our innovation report will lead you through both criteria for formulating the portfolio, and then what we concluded were the biggest breakthrough opportunities from application of those criteria.
Let me just, again, thank you all for being here and tell you in conclusion one of my real frustrations with all of this, not with what you said or anything else. Ever since I was chairman of the Interior Subcommittee, before I became chairman of this committee, and then ranking member of this committee, my frustration is that after 9/11, whenever any federal agency came to see us and they wanted us to do something, or any private company came to see us and they wanted us to do something, we always had to do it because the key phrase was Homeland Security. If you're going to grow corn in Iowa, we were doing it for Homeland Security reasons. And that was the key phrase to get additional funding. Now it is climate change. And nobody can tell me how much money in this federal government we are spending on climate change. I'm not saying it's too much or too little or anything else, but every agency comes. The Forest Service gets money to study climate change. So does the Park Service, even though there ain't a lot of difference between the park and the forest at the border. So I mean, I've thought about trying to gather up all the money that all the agencies spend on climate change and putting it in one budget so that we weren't duplicating efforts, duplicating research, duplicating science, everything else, so that if the Forest Service wanted to do a study on the impacts of climate change on our forests, that they went to this agency, and I thought the USGS might be a good place to put it. But they would, okay, that's, it had been approved by members of scientists and so forth, that's a good study. They would fund it. And then every agency could use those studies and stuff. Somehow we've got to coordinate this a lot better, in my opinion. Not just in the Department of Energy, but throughout the government. Anyway, thank you all for being here. It is a fascinating discussion, one that could go on for hours and hours. But I know that you've been here for a couple hours already.
Thank you, Ranking Member Simpson. In closing today, I've been thinking about the political reality of our country, where there are forces at work to create division among the American people in a whole set of ways, maybe some of it unintentional. But for example, the ownership of our media, where if you live in a rural area, you listen to different stations than if you live in urban America. And the messages that are carried, the kinds of programming and so forth are distinctly different. And I've been asking myself, how does America unite in common cause, and how do we create a green Real Deal that people will embrace, whether they live in rural Ohio and are involved in dairy farming, or if they live in Charlotte and they are involved in the tech industry. So the political question looms large in my mind. And I think about, okay, so goal setting for urban America, metropolitan America, goal setting for rural America. I agree with what Ranking Member Simpson has said about the confusion, in a way, of different agencies taking pieces of this, but again, the whole that people can gravitate to and make a concrete contribution, despite how daunting the challenge seems. We need to make that more clear to the American people. And so that Scout troops know that in Ohio and Michigan, we have to replant minimum 20 million trees. That doesn't even count what farmers have to do to deal with what has happened to our green cover. Somehow, Mr. Secretary, when you talked about the rural or the regional innovation offices that were imagined at DOE but never really implemented, that's kind of I think, important. That's an important thought, because both Ranking Member Simpson and I have served on the Interior Committee, where the Department of Interior redrew America by watersheds. And it was trying to create a different arrangement that we address regionally so everyone felt part of the solution. I'm feeling we have to inch our way toward that rather quickly. And I'm just stating that for the record so that the energy ideas, the energy innovation ideas, and the implementation of those can be done well, the same way we built the interstate highway system. we just didn't leave it to chance. There were mechanisms set in place. We had to cooperate with the states. As I listened to Mayor Lyles, I was thinking about one of my key interests in urban America, which is helping our mayors figure out a way to pay the energy costs of the purification of water and the treatment of sewage. It is one of the largest bills that cities pay across the country, yet it's hidden. Mayors know what it is, but it's not an issue at the U.S. Conference of Mayors or the National League of Cities. And yet, I think innovation there is desperately needed. We have a lot of old plants. Maybe we need to throw them all out. I don't know. But it becomes increasingly more expensive for cities to operate. And if they are economically challenged cities, like Flint, Michigan, it becomes a crisis. And so somehow, regionally, we have to get our arms around this. I think the mayors are very important voices for the country. I think that the national, U.S. Department of Agriculture and the various organizations that represent farmers are very important. But right now, we're not organized regionally through the Green Real Deal for people to be able to look at their region that they know best and really make a concerted effort with certain goals. So one of my questions for the record, unless you feel motivated to answer it now, would be, how would we do that? How would we organize the country to think, and I think watersheds have to be an important part of it because of what's happening with rainfall and all. And how do we connect this to meeting the challenges of changes in our whole ecosystem? The issue of money coming to our labs and to the Department of Energy, I've been amazed at the ability of our labs to be sites where contracts are let from NOAA, from other departments, to our labs. I don't know if Congressman Simpson knows, I don't know the number now, but the contracts that come to the Idaho labs from other departments, that's a way of moving money to our labs. If we could, if we could think about working with our colleagues on appropriations maybe and look at some of the possibilities of adding to the contractual capabilities of DOE to meet some of these goals. But I see a need to somehow create a template that people can buy into at every level. And I'm finding that missing. At the same time as we do the longer-term research, if you give the American people a goal, whether it's NASCAR or whether it's blood pressure, whatever it is, they will meet the goal. But they've got to be able to get their hands around it. So I'm struggling with how do we create this Green Real Deal that people can buy into regionally, and how would one define those regions? And also then, through the Department of Energy and other willing actors, how do we create rewards, for example, for net zero homes? I have been amazed, for instance, at Habitat for Humanity or the work that we do with community gardens. If one person and a group of people create a community garden, within 5 years there'll be 100. The American people pick it up like that. But we've got to figure a way to give them a template that they can actualize. And I think the Department of Energy needs help in doing that, because they are so brilliant and they're involved in such high-level research that sometimes you lose touch with the ground. And so I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling with how to arm my colleagues. How do members of Congress, how does Congresswoman Adams work with the mayor and really create, in whatever you would call the region of Charlotte, actual accomplishments that people could help with if they knew what the goal was. They know what the finish line is, right? And I think we really need help there. I'm not quite sure how to get there. All I know is we need to do it. And so I just wanted to put that on the record. If you could think about that and along the way create public recognition, kind of our net zero homes or number of trees planted or the Academy Award for the best energy innovation. If they're doing the DOE, most of America doesn't know about it. And I heard what you said about education, Mr. Secretary, that in fact those authorities don't exist. Oh my goodness. No wonder we're having so much trouble.
I was going to say, Chairwoman
Yes,
Kaptur,
please.
that I remember during one hearing when I was chairman and you were ranking member, I believe you suggested that Secretary Moniz would be good to do like a Mr. Rogers
Yes.
program for several
Yes.
things that we ran on TV. I remember that.
Yeah, that was one of my great disappointments, Mr. Secretary.
I'll buy a sweater.
Well, this has just been an excellent morning.
Could I make just one more
Yes,
comment?
please,
Madam Chair?
please, Mr.
Just,
Secretary.
I won't try to answer the question about how to do the regional things, but we'd be happy to come in with you and the ranking member and discuss that, because we do have many ideas. But I would just note that I think, again, something that I don't think it would take much prodding to go back and have it actually executed. Towards the end of our term in the DOE, what we did is we put out an RFP for small grants that would come in for ideas as to how to do regional innovation in their region. So rather than dictate it, we asked for some ideas. Unfortunately, I don't think those awards were ever made, but that's an example of a simple thing that could go out and have different groups. Often they were university-led groups, for example, putting together some regional assets, and they would come in and say, I don't know what they would have said, but the idea was come in and tell us how you think a regional innovation system would work for your region, using your assets, addressing your problems. So I think that's an example of a pretty simple step. Not a big money deal.
Thank you. Yes,
Chair,
Mayor
I
Ladd.
just wanted to say thank you for so well speaking the issue and the problem, because we can talk about a lot of things, but some of the decisions that you are wrestling with, we're now doing locally. We're trying to figure out how to pay for things that we require to be a quality place to live. And climate change has so much to do with it. Stormwater, hurricanes, all of these things. So I just want to say you've described what we need to do. We need to have a regional approach, because if you can get a region, then you can go statewide. If you can go statewide, you can then go to cover abroad. But we, right now, are struggling on our own. And our people, or our residents and citizens, they understand the struggle. And we're having to make choices, and we need to work with you to get halfway there. We need your help to get us there. So thank you for the way you've described it, informed it. I think intuitively people know something's not right, and they don't know how to fix it. And I love the gentleman. I've learned as much today about what you're doing as anything, so I'm going to take back a lot of that, but we need to have the ability to share the wealth of information that you've presented today. So thank you very much for allowing Charlotte to be a part of it, and I'm really proud to represent our city. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor Lyles. And I know that Congresswoman Adams couldn't spend the morning with us because she had conflicting hearings herself, but I would just say that the work that she does on agriculture and the importance of that sector as a major component of the solution is extraordinarily important. And I know when you two put your heads together, you're going to come up with something really magnificent. So please share the nature of the hearing she could not hear with her, and we will look for her leadership as well. Mr. Powell.
I'll just say one last thing on this issue of regional innovation. And actually, so Mayor Lyles mentioned in her testimony Duke Energy, headquartered in Charlotte's very important recent goal to go to 100% clean energy, or net zero energy, as they framed it, by 2050. And they're not alone. Over the last year, we've had a wave of our electric utilities around the country, including Idaho Power, make these deep decarbonization goals. And one of the things that's very common about all of the goals made in the past year, folks have said, we've got a terrific set of technologies today that can get us to, in Duke's case, 50% emissions reductions. In Excel's case out west, where there's just, fabulous wind and solar potential, 80% reductions. But we've got a gap, right? And in some sense, you could build a regional innovation policy around whatever it is that each of these utilities that have made these big voluntary commitments say they need to fill the gap, right? So Duke calls it ZELFRs, zero emission load following energy resources, right? Things that don't have any emissions and can ramp up and down fast, right? And so you could go to each of these different regions and say, well, what is it? You've made this, this bold voluntary pledge to get us to a zero emission electricity sector that we can use to decarbonize the whole economy. What is it that you need, right? And I think that would be another really helpful filter. And obviously that will be quite different by region, right? In the Southeast, it's not going to be all renewables. In Ohio, it's not going to be all renewables, right? There's going to be a whole, very different suites of technology in each place. But you could imagine a program that is built around, helping and supporting big voluntary commitments from the private sector.
Thank you for that contribution, Mr.
Madam
Keith.
Chair and Ranking Member, again, thanks to you all for having us here. I might suggest in the realm of setting goals, there's already a foundation for that within DOE, and that's the standards. Those are energy efficiency standards. Those are programs like, it might not be as catchy as Bridge to the 21st Century, but a pretty well-known one, Energy Star, the Energy Star program. So I think I would suggest that it's really important, frankly, for this committee and the appropriations committees generally to protect those types of programs, make sure those standards get out of DOE and get implemented. So I don't know about you all, but everybody that I know always wants to compare how far their car can go on a gallon of gas. We're always comparing mileage and talk to a Tesla guy or somebody with a plug-in, and then, well, you're out of the market if you're not, if you don't have a electric vehicle of some sorts. But if we could build, first of all, protect those energy efficiency standards, protect programs like Energy Star, and then perhaps figure out ways to consumerize them. Maybe the Department of Energy isn't the best at consumer marketing, I don't know, no offense. But the standards and the foundation for those types of goals are already in place.
All right, we thank you all very much. I just wanted to say, since we are being carried inside Congress today at 5:30, we're going to have a showing of a film called Planet Ocean. And what's so great about this film, in my opinion, I think it was done by the Australians. It wasn't done in this country. But it's so, to me, descriptive of how warming waters impact climate and weather conditions across the entire world. And people can kind of think about what's happening in their regions of the country. We have so many members that have experienced extreme flooding, those that have lived in coastal environments and have just been beaten by hurricanes and big storms, Sandy, Katrina, you name it, and winds. There are these conditions that are occurring now. We worked in conjunction with the Healing Our Waters Coalition, the Ocean Conservancy, and Congressman Paul Tonko of New York, who is very, very, very involved in climate change issues, is helping to co-sponsor this. It'll be in room 2362B of this building of Rayburn, and it will start at 5:30. It takes about an hour. So if people want popcorn and they want to come and just listen, we hope to, again, visually demonstrate some of the work that we do as verified by outside actors. So again, that's at 5:30 today, Planet Ocean, room 2362B here in Rayburn. I would like to say that this concludes this morning's hearing. We haven't done that badly in terms of keeping in time. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us and ask the witnesses to please ensure for the hearing record that questions for the record and any supporting information or ideas you have requested by the subcommittee are delivered in final form to us no later than 3 weeks from the time you receive them. Members who have additional questions for the record will have until the close of business this Friday, tomorrow, to provide them to the subcommittee office. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.